Hey, good morning, and welcome back to the channel. Hope you guys are having a great week out there. I have been really busy here lately, and I apologize. I did not get a stream out last week. It was just simply too busy. But I had a little bit of time here this week. Was able to kind of get caught up on a couple of things. So excited to be able to put together a stream this morning. And I wanted to kind of focus on one major thing here as we get going. And if you saw the title of the video, then you kind of know where we're headed with our topic today on grading. And I'll kind of fill you in a little bit on my thoughts related to that here in just a moment. Before I get into that, though, I had a situation this week, kind of a realization, not necessarily a situation, but it came to a realization this week as I was reviewing through some of my social media timelines on Facebook and Twitter. And one of the things that I've noticed that we've seen here in recent times, and I don't know really if there's any correlation to the pandemic related to this, or just if it's something in general that we're seeing. It's kind of hard to parse things out right now because of how crazy everything is from a political standpoint. And I know that it had been increasingly getting to that direction in recent history. I really always kind of point to the Obama administration as far as kind of really seeing this hardcore divide between both sides becoming more radicalized, in the middle kind of getting drowned out. And then, of course, that was taken up, another level during the Trump administration. And, in the aftermath of Biden winning the election and where we are today, and maybe, the whole January 6th thing has something to do with this as well. I have made observations to various different friends and on different platforms that right now the Republican Party is in shambles. There doesn't really seem to be a cohesive, structure to it. At best, there are some people who have picked up the mantle and said, I'm going to represent what I think is conservatism or republicanism, knowing that those aren't necessarily one and the same, but at least it's packaged that way. And so, a guy like Ron DeSantis is someone that's, kind of looked at right now as the torchbearer for the Republican Party. At a national level, though, there really isn't much leadership that is coming out there. So one of the strategies that I've seen as pushback to some of the bold attempts to, redesign society, basically, that's like the best way that I can think to describe it, particularly by those with a liberal, left-leaning agenda, is to point out the hypocrisy. There's a couple of different accounts on various different social media outlets, particularly one that I see a lot on Twitter called Defiant L's, which is basically taking tweets from people, again, generally on the left, where during the Trump administration, they were, completely against something, but then now that Biden's in office, they're all for it, right? So this is kind of like the whole vaccine thing. Early on, people were like, "Oh, the Trump vaccine, that's never going to work. You're an idiot to think that there's this vaccine, yada yada yada." And now all of a sudden they're like, "You're an idiot if you don't take the vaccine." So it's that kind of like paradoxical thinking, and it is funny to kind of laugh at and see that. But my kind of epiphany with that is, at some point, we have to move beyond that, because the thing that I think I've realized here, and I could be wrong by this, but I think I'm pretty in tune with this, is they don't care. Okay, they really don't care. They don't. There's no integrity. There's no sense of consistency in their thinking, and they're just outright, blatant with it at this point. And that's not to say that, people on the right don't fall into that trap as well. That's one of the things that I hate about politics, identity politics is, I've made this claim for both Republicans and Democrats, is that, I used to say that I respected liberals in that at least they would tell you what they want to do. They would say, hey, I want to, tax like crazy and spend, and I want all these social programs, and I think government can solve all the problems. And one of the things that always frustrated me about Republicans is they would stand in front of the camera, the microphone, and say, I'm for limited government, I'm for small government, all this, that. And then they would get in office and they would govern like liberals, right? And we always used to point to the Bush administration, as a prime example of that. And obviously we see that in a lot of other places today. So again, kind of, something to think about is, it feels good, right, to call them out on these inconsistencies. And, we can keep doing that all day long. I mean, literally, we could have people that just dedicate their entire messaging to pointing out the hypocrisy of liberals in terms of, what they have said before in the past, and now that their guy's in office, what they're currently saying. But, again, my larger point here is I don't think they care. And I don't know how much it's moving the needle. Like who's seeing that and then all of a sudden thinking like, oh, okay, well, I don't agree with that ideology, or, I was kind of thinking this, but now that you showed me that, I've changed my mind. Again, I think, it's kind of a fun exercise to do it because it, gets them in a gotcha moment or, whatever. But I don't know, like, I just was thinking that if we're putting all of our eggs into that basket, or we're spending a majority of our time just simply trying to call out the hypocrisy, at some point we have to move beyond that. Like, I think we've already accomplished the task of identifying that these people are hypocrites. And so now the next thing is, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Right. And that's where I think if there is going to be a resistance to the cultural Marxism and ideology that is increasingly becoming more of the mainstream left, and we see it invading into so many different aspects of our life. And I mean, look at all of the different places where we see this and how quickly it's happening. I forget who I was reading or watching a video on one time who talked about, how quickly things can fall. And how important it is for those who are against this kind of thinking to stand and fight. And so, again, that's where I think we need to be focusing a lot of our attention. And as it relates, obviously, to, our world and mostly what I tend to focus on in my work, which is education, we're doing that. We see people who are digging in and fighting, and obviously we want to try to do that in the most appropriate manner and the way that's going to get the best results. And I think we are starting to see slowly some dividends. I think we're starting to see some payoff from the pressure. It seems like increasingly there are more and more people who are stepping up, who were kind of on the sidelines, not sure about things, but because of the persistence of some voices and exposing what is going on in our public schools, I am starting to see more people step up and be bold and brave with their messaging, and then also taking action. Right, that's the biggest thing is starting to take action, because that's obviously where you're going to see results. We can show up to board meetings and we can express ourselves on social media platforms, but at the end of the day, if it's not resulting in any change in behavior or the situation, then again, it's almost kind of like the same situation where we're just spitting into the wind, as they say, and nothing is really ever getting accomplished there. So I kind of wanted to throw that out there as food for thought. Okay, so the topic that I wanted to kind of focus on as it relates to education this week is on the topic of grades and grading in school. And again, there's a couple of reasons why I wanted to point this out. I think, again, the whole COVID, masks, not masks, and even, kind of like the CRT, SEL stuff is super important. And I don't want to ever claim that we shouldn't focus on those things. But one of the things that I've tried to accomplish in the work that I've done on advocacy and raising awareness on what our public schools look like is to kind of say there are foundational and fundamental things beyond the things that have popped up over the last year and a half or coming up on 2 years now, and that we need to focus on these as well. These are just as important as fighting for those other issues as well. And so this past week, we had parent-teacher conferences at my kids' schools, and went in and met with the teachers, most of the teachers in both of my boys, who are one's in 6th and one's in 8th grade. So they're both in our local middle school. And it was just kind of fascinating, as obviously an educator, I was more going in kind of observing how the teachers were interacting with us as parents. Not to say that that's like necessarily a unique position. Obviously, there are many teachers who have children in schools, and so I'm sure they kind of go through the same thing as well. But I was just kind of curious, I really went in kind of focused on how are they representing what they're seeing from my kids, right? Like, how are they choosing to be able to explain to me as the parent, now that we are a couple months into the school year, what they are seeing about my kids' achievement. And so, and again, listen, I'm awful with names. It's not a secret there with that, and so the first thing that I kind of always notice, and I do have a little bit of sympathy, is how many of the teachers can acknowledge when I say the kid's name, because I'll come in and I'll say something like, "Oh, how's the year going?" And they'll kind of say, "Oh yeah, it's going pretty well. We're getting settled into routine." And I'll say something like, "Oh well, my son," I'll say, is that like Lucas or Logan, they really are enjoying the class. So I'm giving them a cue, right? Like, I'm giving them the first name. I'm not going to make them try to cold, because they probably can't associate us with them. They haven't seen us all that much. There's a few teachers who recognize us from the kids. But then, there's a handful that are like, remind me again. So that, that's kind of always interesting to think a little bit about there. And I think it says something more larger to, the fact that they've got 100 and some students that they see on a daily basis, versus, them necessarily knowing my kids. I don't necessarily hold anything against them for that. But at any rate, it was kind of fascinating to see which of the teachers just kind of talked casually, conversationally, about what was going on in the class. And I saw that from a couple of the teachers. And I started kind of also then thinking a little bit about, what do my kids say about those teachers? And I found something that I think is kind of interesting here. And again, this isn't scientific, but it seemed to me that when we entered into the room with those teachers who kind of just, had conversation with us, talked with us, gave us, filled us in on how things were going, what they're doing in class, overall observations about the kids' performance in the class. But it was very much more, again, casual. My kids seem to like those teachers. Those are the ones that we hear the kids come home talking about, and having a positive impact and really enjoying the way that they teach and the content in their class, the way it's delivered, versus the ones who, when we sat down, kind of immediately jumped to data. Right. And this is a trend in education, in terms of, what we look at for achievement with our students. And it was kind of fascinating to see, those who immediately pulled up the digital grade book, flipped the computer around, started going through each and every assignment, justifying and rationalizing grades that were assigned to those assignments and tests, and really kind of just focusing more on the tasks and the assignments than they did the people, the kids, right? And I even tried to, cue them and say, hey, like, tell me a little bit about, what they're doing in class, or how my son or sons are reacting to or engaging. And it was difficult to get there with that. So I kind of thought that was interesting there to see as well. So I thought that was kind of a telltale sign a little bit as to where we see the role of grades and data in schools. And I would say overall, the prevailing sentiment is the direction from building principals and from obviously superintendents in school districts is to focus on the data. I saw that a lot shortly after I got into teaching. It was all about data, everything. And I know it's been that way for a long time, but I know that it seemed like once I got into probably about my second or third year of teaching, it was hyper focused on data driven instruction, looking at micro data in the classroom, macro data in terms of standardized test scores, combining them together, ranking kids, looking at the bottom 20%, because a lot of the manner in which the schools were being graded and looked at by the state was on growth. And so you obviously get your growth from the bottom because they have the largest area to grow from. You don't get your growth from the top. So, those kids were all okay. We don't need to spend as much time focused on that. You spend all your time on the bottom 20%. And then what kind of makes all that worse is like the kids at the top, they have like accelerated programs, honors programs. Obviously those kids typically aren't any kind of behavioral issues, so they kind of just get left alone. Then you got the bottom 20% where you're hyper focused, you're using all of your aids, your remedial classes, your resources, all of that stuff is going there. And then you have this wide swath of kids in the middle who are just being shuffled through, right? They're not quite showing tendencies to be in honors classes, but their scores aren't low enough to place them in remedial classes or in extra help sessions or whatever. So they're just kind of there, right? And that's something that I think was pointed out by John Taylor Gatto in either Dumbing Us Down or Weapons of Mass Instruction. I forget which book it was, where he talked about how, this middle group, this large group of students is just shuffled from one class to another each year. And so along with that, and again, what really kind of inspired me to think about reflecting on what grades even mean is, when I started thinking about what these teachers of my children were saying about the achievement that they've seen from my boys so far, some of them, again, tended to focus on here's where they are letter grade wise, right? Versus here's what I see as strengths and weaknesses just in general. And we know that grades are a flawed way of reflecting on the achievement of our students, of our children. And there's all kinds of research out there that talks about trying to redefine the way in which we assess achievement in the classroom. But for some reason, this has stuck, and it's been there for a long period of time as well, which is probably one of the reasons why so many places have a difficult time getting it amended or changed or doing away with it altogether, because it's the safety net in education, right? At the end of the day, it's easy to say I can assign an A through F letter grade, either for a particular assessment or for the class as a whole. Obviously, as you get a little bit higher up in the educational world, you start talking about the impact of grades as it relates to higher ed. So I've heard a lot of, for example, high school teachers and counselors and staff that will say, well, we can't, modify this because that will hurt our students' opportunities and chances of getting into colleges if they don't have a GPA or letter grades assigned to their classes. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion too and debate about the role of like homework and testing and everything like that. So how do we make sense of what that score or that letter grade really means as far as measuring achievement? And in my opinion, really all that grades do is harm. I don't think there's much positive that we get out of, looking at a grade for either an individual assessment, whether that's a homework assignment, quiz, test, project, or whatever, or an overall class grade. I don't see much good that comes out of that. Now, you could potentially say, for those who know how to play the game of school and can get good grades, it boosts their confidence and helps them to feel good about themselves, to see that, hey, I'm an A student or I'm an AB student, I made AB honor roll. There are things that you can say for that. But even with that, what does that even mean? Right. That's my question that I'm trying to get people to wrestle with is, when we see these grades that are assigned to students in schools, what does it even really mean? What are we gleaning from that? Are we being able to look at the grades and say, that means you're proficient, you've mastered the content? What is the content? Right. I've got a son who plays school very well. He's very thorough. He does a good job. He's a people pleaser. So he typically performs very well in terms of grades. Right. Now, does that necessarily mean that he's mastered the content? Does that necessarily mean that he fully understands and is ready to move on from whatever it is that he's quote unquote got an A on to something more challenging? And that is where I'm saying we need to hit the pause button, because I don't know that that's necessarily the case. In some instances, it is, right? In some instances, we can say, okay, you've got an A here. We can clearly see through other demonstrations that the content. And that's what I want to focus on more, is the other demonstrations, right? How do we look at what a grade says and be able to make sense of it? Well, we can test the kids in other ways besides just reciting rote memorization of facts, right? We could have them create things. We could have them explain things. We can have them defend positions on how they would approach a topic, right? Obviously, these things all vary depending upon the curriculum and the content, right? So if you're talking about, for example, a math concept, right? How do we demonstrate that students know and can apply the knowledge of a multiplication table, right? Or are we just after memorization of it? Because that was one of the things I saw a lot of emphasis on early in my children's education in math, was just a memorization of times tables. And I'm sitting back going like, what does it mean that they can memorize it? Because my son struggled with it early on, and he's in honors math now. But in multiplication tables, he struggled with a few of them. And it just became a game of teaching him how to memorize it. But then if I said, okay, here's a real world problem where I need you to use multiplication, right? Maybe it was something for cooking or, whatever it was, that I would have him then try to apply that. He couldn't do it. He could recall it on the table that he had in front of him because he had memorized through patterns. And there's some benefit to memorization, but at this point, the goal was knowing how to multiply two numbers together. And he couldn't do that initially. So again, there's a lot of concern, I think, with what grades actually indicate and show us in terms of overall achievement. And we really need to start kind of rethinking ways in which we can measure achievement and accountability. So I mentioned earlier that there's really not much good that comes out of it. And it's not even necessarily that there's not much good. There's a lot of harm that comes from this as well. If you have children in school, you probably know the impact that grades have on their overall psyche, right? And their overall confidence and emotional well-being. And I know for, example, my youngest son, who does play school very well, gets good grades, he gets really shaken when he gets a bad grade. It really, really affects him. He had a social studies test the other day on capitals of Middle East countries, and he struggled with it because it's a new concept to him. He hasn't been in control of it for a long period of time. He had some time to study for it, but he didn't do very well on it. And it has affected him, to the point where I'm like, don't worry about it. What does it even mean? We'll get it. It's fine. It's not the end of the world. But to him, it is, because the system has told him that, grades matter and grades are important. And it's good, obviously, to have goals and, to try to want to perform well. I get all that. I'm not discounting that. But if we've put so much stock into that to the point where children, and I've seen this as well in my time in the classroom as a teacher, that there are high performing students that are so hyper focused on the grade. And, kind of then another side effect of that is they've always performed well. So then when they don't perform well, they don't know how to handle it. They're mental capacity to be able to handle getting a C on something doesn't compute because I'm not a C student. I'm an A student, right? So when they produce C level work and you try to give them feedback and criticism and critique on their work, they melt down. They don't have the resiliency to be able to handle that. And I've seen a number of students who have been shuffled through in that manner. So that's kind of how it affects the upper half. Obviously, for the lower half, students who don't play the game of school well, who don't fit into that one size fits all model, who haven't always received high marks on their classes, what does that communicate to them? Their failures, right? That they need extra help, that they need remediation, that they just don't have what it takes to succeed. And whether or not, obviously, I'm not saying that, in every school building across the country, teachers are going around literally saying that. Some they might be. I've seen some videos of some teachers that have melted down on students in that regard. But it's the overall message that it's sending, right? That your ability to be able to achieve to a certain level of this content just isn't there. And why is that? Do you not have the mental capacity to be able to do it? Do you not have the work ethic to do it? Do you not have the motivation to want to do it? Obviously there's a lot of reasons as to why that might be happening, but regardless, the bottom line is, what does that letter grade communicate to the student, right? It communicates that they don't have what it takes. And so we blame the student as opposed to taking a step back and saying, why is it that Johnny has never earned above a D in a class? Or why is it that this student performs well on certain things, but then when it comes to the test, they kind of struggle. They have anxiety or performance, related issues with, reciting information, remembering different things. And what does that really mean, though, about their overall understanding? Do they still understand the content? If you sat down and you talked with them about what they learned, they could tell you a lot of really good information. But then when you put that test in front of them and you give them, multiple choice, fill in the blank, true, false, short answer, whatever it is, they seize up, or they can't, recite it back the way that you're wanting to see it. And so again, there are all kinds of issues related to that as well. And again, I think then probably the most harmful thing that we see with this as we kind of go through is then, because of the grades that are assigned, we end up tracking these students, right? And we end up identifying and labeling them. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, these kids are in the bottom 20% of their class. These kids are struggling in reading and math. And obviously that's what a lot of schools tend to focus on because of what we have here in the state of Indiana, iLearn, or some kind of aptitude test, standardized test to be able to pass the class or, ultimately show their proficiency. And then you're just teaching to the test, right? You're just teaching them how to take the test. And I heard that from one of the kids' teachers on student parent-teacher conferences. And so there's obviously issues related to that as well. And so, again, I think that there's a lot of negative that comes out of the way in which we apply grades to our kids. It can be harmful on both ends of the spectrum. And then, as I mentioned, that middle group of kids that are harmed as well. And again, I would just kind of wrap up this message too by trying to encourage you as a parent, grandparent, or stakeholder in education as well, to say, at the end of the day, what do grades really accomplish? And I'll leave this for you to kind of consider and think about as well. And you can find lots of examples out there of this where you see stories nationally of, school systems that are bragging and boasting about their graduation rate. They're talking about how all of these kids are graduating. Even those inside the school system know how worthless grades really are. It's just a game, and they are gaming the system. And by they, I mean the school systems, because at the end of the day, at least again, here in the state of Indiana, for high schools, one of the biggest metrics that they care about is their graduation rate. And there's others as well. But many high schools are really focused on that graduation rate. And so what do? They shuffle kids through and they apply pressure. And they can say and justify it however they want. I've been in that situation as a government and economics teacher for seniors. I have had situations where counselors have approached me and all but said, we need to make sure this student passes no matter what. And I mean, I'm talking like I've had kids with below a 30% in a class before, where I've had a guidance counselor come to me and say, what do we need to do to get this kid to pass? And I'm sitting there going like, they can't. There's no way, right? Short of me creating some, alternative curriculum for them to basically demonstrate everything that they've done prior to the end of the semester that they should have been doing all along. And there's been some, ridiculous exemption or, whatever it might be. But the pressure has been there to say we need to get this kid to pass. And, a lot of times, even prior to that, they want kids who aren't tracked to be able to get a core diploma out of the building. I led a program at a school one time that was designed for seniors who had enough credits to be able to go to school for half a day and go work a half a day. And I was told that, this would be a program that would be of benefit to those who were looking at entering directly into the workforce and weren't thinking about college. And come to find out, really all it was that the principal of the building wanted these kids out of the building because they were a headache. And the more I tried to apply pressure to say, these are the needs that I have to make this work, the more I found out that they didn't really care. They just wanted the kids out of the building, right? They want to get rid of kids that are perceived as headaches to them. And they will do whatever it takes, including forging grades that aren't really earned. Right. That's the thing about a grade is we hold this kind of idea that grades are earned. Grades are given in a lot of cases, whether it's through pressure from parents sometimes or pressure through administrators. And again, I want to be very clear. I've never, ever in my time in the classroom, I've never had a principal or anyone else in a leadership position change a grade on me. I've never had that happen, to my knowledge, at least. What I have had, though, is that subliminal messaging, right? That kind of pressure of, hey, what can we do to make sure that, Johnny graduates? What do we got to do to make sure that they get that 60%, which, by the way, is a whole nother thing. It's like all of a sudden, magically at 59%, they're not passing, but that one extra percent to 60, then that certifies that they're proficient in the content and that they can earn a passing grade, a diploma, or whatever that might be. And so there's obviously issues that we have to consider and think about with that as well. And as we wrap this up, again, I highly encourage you guys, if you haven't had a chance to read this, The Case Against Education by Dr. Brian Kaplan from George Mason University. This is a phenomenal book. He spends a lot of time talking about why the education system is a waste of money and resources. And one of the things that he kind of hones in on in this is that really all education or schooling is a signaling mechanism to the workforce out there, right? And as students obviously get a little bit older and they get toward high school and they start thinking about, okay, college versus the workforce or a gap year or whatever it might be, that every class that you take and even on into college is really just a signal to the marketplace as to it might be it being indicative of your performance, right? Will you perform the tasks and duties of the job? Not necessarily that they care so much about the content that you can bring, the knowledge that you can bring, or even the skills that you can bring to the organization, but more just how will you perform as a worker? Will you show up on time? Will you do what you're asked to do? Be obedient. Will you be organized? How much will you have to be managed versus being autonomous and left alone to work? Those are the things that they're looking for as they assess grades and grade point averages and things of that nature, or different degrees, right? Associates, bachelors, masters, and so on. And so really that's all it is. So if that is the case, which I tend to agree with that, he's got a lot of great statistical data. He's an economics professor. He's got a lot of great statistical data to support that position, that should cause us to go back and say, okay, how are we assessing our students in schools? How are we teaching our students in schools? What are we teaching our students in schools? It really should cause us to go back and reconsider the entire setup of the way in which we attempt to educate the citizens of our country. But yet we see this same model that has existed now for over 100 years, and we've tweaked it and we've changed some terminology, and then we've recycled things over and over again. As I was having a conversation with someone the other day about pedagogy or best practices in the classroom as an educator, there's no such thing. All there is recycled ideas that get applied new labels, that get applied new terminology, and we put it in a shiny new box, and we say, oh, look, we're meeting the needs where our kids are. We're trying to close the achievement gap. We're trying to do all these things, but we're not. We're not doing that. We're doing the same thing over and over with a new title or a new name or something along those lines. We've been doing this now for how long, and we're getting the same results. Something has to change. There has to be an agent of change, someone bold and brave enough in the system to say, we're no longer going to continue to do it the way that we have been. And that's where I kind of always get tickled, because educators are really fond of, the saying of like, the most dangerous phrase in society is, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. And they love that. I've seen that, up on posters in classrooms and on teachers' social media pages and things like that. And I sit there and I go, you're a part of an education system that is doing the same thing that it's been doing now for centuries. And yet there's this refusal to allow real change to enter in. Why? Because you're scared, because it may cost you your job, because it might look different. It may not work out initially, and there may be some struggling in there, but that's what change is, right? That's how we get better as people, as a society, is by trying things out and improving what we've been doing. But for whatever reason, we don't do that in education, because of, again, maybe the feeling of safety and how we've always done it, and we know what we're going to get. But yeah, what we get is trash, right? We don't get positive results out of this. The education system in America does not benefit the majority of our children, even those who play the game well and show the appearance that they have earned the grades, that show that they have learned all of these things. And again, in that book, Case Against Education, Dr. Kaplan talks about learning loss, talks about how people who have taken all of these classes and gotten all this knowledge can't remember anything by the time they enter into their workforce in their adult years. So, again, I think that in and of itself, set aside grades, should give us pause to say, wait a second, we clearly aren't doing something right here. What do we need to do? So again, that's what I would encourage you to think about here a little bit, is as you are, obviously assessing. And I know as a parent, we can get caught up into what's your grade in that class right now. We need to keep your grades up. Grades are important. I get all that. But I also think we need to start taking a mind shift away from that and focusing more on the process of learning. Tell me how you're learning this. Show me what you're learning, and have real, authentic discussions with our children on the knowledge that they're learning and how they're going to apply that, and giving them the opportunity to apply it. A lot of times they don't get that because they're stuck in a building all day. So I think that's something that would be much more beneficial to our kids as we think about the concept of mastery in learning information. All right, that's going to do it for the stream this week. I hope you've enjoyed hearing this. Please feel free to give me some feedback, comments, questions, anything along those lines. If you have topics that you'd like for me to address or cover, I would always love to hear that as well. Thank you so much. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.